Hello and welcome to today's tutorial. First of all, you're going to want to print the reference image. You'll find that in the description box below this video. Then take a graphite pencil and scribble on the back of your printed picture. Then placing it on top of your watercolour paper, you use a HB pencil to trace those outlines. You want to trace the inner shape of the teasel head, and we'll be painting the details of the spikes in later, but there's absolutely no need to trace each of those lines. So you can see here that I've traced the inner shape, not the outer shape of the teasel head. So we'll have chance to paint in the individual spikes later on. So using a bit of crimson and cerulean blue, we're going to be mixing up a colour to use in the background. Crimson is much stronger than cerulean blue, so you'll need to add quite a lot of it to change the crimson to a sort of a grey purple colour. So into the cerulean blue, I've already activated my paints with a little bit of water to get them started. And I want to pick up as much blue as I can and mix it in with the crimson, sorry. And you can see that this is quite a red purple that I've got here. And actually what I want to achieve is this sort of grey purple. So I'm going to need to add a lot more of the cerulean blue to create that mix that I want for the background. So I'm going to wash off my brush and add more of the cerulean blue paint. So you'll be wanting to do this bit by bit until you get a colour that you're happy with. And you can see there that that's changed the colour nicely just by adding that extra bit of cerulean blue. So here you can see the colours that I've mixed. I've actually added some more water, so it's lightened that purple, and that's the one that I'm going to use. But first of all, I'm going to wet the paper. I want to make sure that I've got a good coverage of water. I'm going to take a number 18 brush. It's a really big brush, so don't be afraid of getting out those big brushes for this. So I'm applying some water to the surface of the paper and I'm spreading it out. I don't want any puddles here, so I'm making sure to spread it out nicely. Just take your time and check from the side, tilt the board, and you'll notice there's a soft sheen without any puddles. Now I'm using a large flat brush to apply my purple grey colour, and I'm just wanting to create sort of some geometrical, quite abstract marks in the background of this painting. So what's happening is, because I've wet the paper, it's softening the edges of those marks nicely. Just add a little bit more. So I've not covered it completely in the background. I've left some white of the paper. Now I'm going to dot in some little spots of water to that paint while it's still slightly damp. And that's going to create some watercolour bloom, so a little bit of texture in the background of my painting. It's really subtle because the paint's very pale, but then you have to let this fully dry. So I'm just dabbing on a bit of water there with my brush. So you can see that it's all dry now, and I'm going to take a number 6 brush and also a number 10 round brush as well to do the next step. And we're going to be looking at painting the heads of the teasels. So I've mixed up a slightly darker purple, so I've added more red to make it slightly more purple than grey this time. And I've also got some burnt sienna on my palette ready to go. So you can see there's the burnt sienna, quite pale, so lots of water in the mix. So I'm going to wet the head of the teasel first, just up to the outline that I drew. And remember, this is the inner part of the teasel head. We're not painting any of the spikes yet. So I'm just taking that number 6 brush and I'm wetting the head of the teasel carefully up to the edge of the shape. Now I'm going in with another number 6 brush, this time to add the burnt sienna paint. I'm starting at the top of the shape and working my way gradually down. And I'm going to leave a little bit of the white of the paper at the bottom. And that's where I'm going to add some of that purple colour that I mixed. So I'm going in with some of the purple now at the bottom of the teasel head, and because the area is still damp, it spreads nicely and blends on the surface. And you can see there it's softening those spots of paint nicely. I'm just going to dab on a few extra towards the top. It's just going to create a nice texture to the first coat of the teasel head. And you can see that purple's added nice interest as well. So I'm going to go ahead and do the second teasel head now. So remember, wetting the surface first. Really carefully around those lines, because anywhere that this water lays on the paper, the paint is going to want to spread into that water. So if you actually go over your lines with the water, then you'll have an untidy edge. It'll want to run into that water wherever you've placed it. So just take care when you're adding the water. So again, starting at the top with the burnt sienna, just drawing it down and around the shape. Just filling out that shape. And again, I'm going to leave a little bit of the white paper at the bottom. And that's where I'm going to apply the purple shade that we mixed before. So if you just use the tip of your brush and allow that purple paint to spread into the burnt sienna nice and softly, just using sort of dabbing motions, creates these soft edges and blends together nicely on the surface. So exactly the same with the third teasel head here. You can see I've just wet the surface. Now I'm adding the burnt sienna. And then finally the purple. And then I'm going to allow it to dry. So now these have dried, I'm going to work on the centre teasel head. I'm going to wet the area again to begin with, just with a little clean water, so that the area is damp when I apply some more paint. I'm going to be careful not to press on too hard with the brush, because I don't want to disturb the paint that I've already laid down underneath. So I'm just wetting the area gently. And I've mixed a slightly darker burnt sienna, and also I'm going to start using the yellow ochre paint now as well. So first of all, I'm going to pop down some burnt sienna and strengthen the centre of that teasel head. So you can see I'm just dabbing the paint on gently and it's merging into that wet area. And I'm going to leave a space on the outside, and that's where I'm going to add the yellow ochre. So I'm just dotting the yellow to blend in a little bit with the burnt sienna that's wet on the surface. And then I'm going to use this yellow ochre with a smaller brush to draw out some of those spikes. So I'm going to switch to a small brush. This is a number 6, and I'm just going to use the very tip of the bristles to draw out sort of flicks of that yellow ochre paint. So I've got some yellow ochre on my brush, but I'm also going into the yellow ochre that I placed down on the teasel head and pushing it out, flicking it out, creating these spiky shapes. And I'm following the reference image because it's sort of longer hairs, spikes on the top, or the tip, if you like, of the head, and they get shorter as they come round the sides of the shape. So just use your reference image as a guide and overlap each little spike as well. You don't want a stripy effect. You want them to sort of touch at the sides. So I find it easier to move my board than to try and move my arm. So if you tilt your board and turn it round, you'll find that you'll have a much easier time of painting these sharp spikes. So use a light touch and a flicky motion and just the very tip of your brush to draw out the paint. So we're creating these lighter spikes. So the centre of the teasel head is much darker than the spikes on the outside because that's where the light is hitting it. So I'm using some more of the burnt sienna now and drawing some of that up to the base of some of these spikes, and it's adding some depth. So you can see I've left the tips of the spikes this sort of yellow ochre colour, but drawing some of that burnt sienna along them. You get a sort of a halo effect where the sun is hitting the tips of those spikes. So I'm using a thicker consistency of burnt sienna now. So I've added a little bit more paint to the mix and less water. And I'm just dotting it on to the base of the head of the teasel. This is going to create a more three-dimensional shape and add depth to the painting. So I'm just dotting it on, still while the paper is damp, so it softens the marks that I'm making. If the paper was dry, then I'd end up with lots of dots and it would look not very natural at all. So I'm going to do exactly the same thing for the other two teasel heads, starting by wetting the surface of the paper and then dabbing on some of the burnt sienna to darken the centres, and then using the yellow ochre paint at the edges and then drawing that yellow ochre out to create the spikes. So remember, a light touch to create those spikes. You don't want to apply too much pressure to your brush. That way you can create a much finer mark. Just use a flicky motion with your wrist. Again, wet the surface first, and then you get these soft marks. Dotting on the burnt sienna to begin with, and then going in with the yellow ochre on the edges. And remember to use a small brush to create these spikes. So I'm using a number 6 brush. Move your board to make it easier for you to paint. And then allow those to dry. So next we're going to be looking at the stems. And these two particular stems are more green, so I'm mixing a green using the yellow ochre and the cerulean blue, and it creates a sort of an olive green. So to paint the stems, I'm going to be wetting the area first, just like I did with the teasel heads. So just draw your brush from the top all the way down to the bottom of the stem. Don't overload your brush too much with water because then you'll flood the paper. So you just want the paper to be damp. And that gives me a little bit more time to do the painting. So I'm going in with my green mix, starting at the top, working my way down. Then you can go back in and add a little bit more paint. And to add some of the shadow beneath the teasel head, I'm using some burnt sienna. And while this green is damp, you can draw some burnt sienna down the stem of the teasel, and it'll create sort of shadow effects. And that will blend nicely with the green paint that's already there. Because it's still damp, it blends on the surface for you. Just going in with a little bit more green. So you can keep doing this until you're happy whilst the paint is still damp. So I've traced, we're going to add the hairs later on. So you need these stems to be thoroughly dry before we do that. And I traced just the outline of the stem. I didn't trace any of the hairs at all. So again, for the second stem, just in with the green. I damped the paper first and then adding the burnt sienna shadow details. Adding that water just allows us more time to have a damp surface to add the paint to. It stops us from getting any hard lines. So now those have dried, and we've used that flicky technique for the spikes. I'm going to look at the curly sections at the bottom of the teasel heads next. I'm not quite sure what they're called, but we're going to paint those in using the green colour. I've mixed up a slightly thicker green, and I'm working on dry paper because obviously this is a detailed section now. So by working on dry paper, have a little bit more control as to where the paint goes. It's not going to flow or flood into any sections that I don't want it to. So turn your board when it's necessary to make it easier for you. And I draw the paintbrush down one edge of the line, and then I go back and I sort of fill in the rest of the shape afterwards, creating the thickness that I need. Always start at the top of a shape and work your way down towards you. It's much easier than trying to push the paintbrush away from you. So start at the top, at the tip, and draw the brush down towards you. And then fill in as you need to create that thickness of the shape. So I'm just speeding up the video here for you and just continuing to do those curly spiky shapes at the bottom of the teasel heads. So use your reference image, refer to that, and it'll really help you as to where these shapes are. Some of them overlap the teasel heads, so you need to just use that reference image as a guide. Keep turning your board when it's necessary, and keep applying the paint. Obviously, using just a number 6 brush, it doesn't hold quite as much paint, so you'll need to go back to your palette to add more paint. So now that the stems have dried, we can paint the very light hairs on the sides of those stems, but you must make sure that they're dry first. So we're going to use the yellow ochre to paint these with a nice thin brush. So I'm using my number 6 brush again. And the easiest way is to draw a line of paint down the side of the stem. So on the outside of the stem that you've painted. And then we're going to flick away from the stem outwards to create these hairs. So again, turn your board, make it as easy as possible, and use these little flicking motions. They're only very thin hairs, very short hairs. So use your reference image. They're a little bit longer at the top, and then they're much shorter as you come down the stem. So just dot on the paint where you need to, drag it out a little bit. Hardly any pressure on that paintbrush yet there, just a very light pressure. Otherwise you'll create very thick marks and they won't look like hairs. So draw the paint down first and then drag it out. Okay, so the hairs on the right aren't quite as long if you refer to your reference image. So I'm just drawing the paint down the stem. Again, that's outside the stem. So I'm not painting over any green at all. I'm actually adding a new line of paint on the outside of the stem. And then I'm using little tiny little marks to create these fine hairs. So I'm doing exactly the same thing for the other 2 stems. Remember, a really light pressure on the brush and just observe where you see these hairs, because in the central one that I'm painting now, there aren't as many. It's not as, it doesn't seem to be as densely thick with hair, so just observe that for yourself. So next I'm going to be painting the stems in the background. I'm going to be painting wet on dry using the same green. and just starting again at the top and then drawing a line following my traced line. I'm drawing a line down with the brush and then I'm filling out that space. And while the paint is still damp, I can go in with a little bit of the burnt sienna to add details and interest to that stem. So I'm just touching the end of the bristles with the burnt sienna, and it's just adding that colour to the stem there. So you can see I'm using the two colours simultaneously. I'm adding the green paint first, and then I'm going into that wet green paint with some of the burnt sienna. It stops the shape from being flat. If I were to just paint it green, it would look quite flat and unrealistic. So by using the two colours and using them at the same time, they blend together nicely on the surface. So starting again with the green, filling out that shape, and then while it's damp, adding some touches of the burnt sienna. As soon as the paint starts to dry, don't go into it anymore. So while the paint's damp, it's safe to add your burnt sienna, but as soon as that green begins to dry on the surface, you don't want to touch it again. So just be mindful as to how wet the paint is on your paper. Obviously, if it's a warm room, then it's going to dry much quicker and you won't have very long to add any extra details. So I've painted all the stems there, and now I'm going to create a very pale yellowy green mix using the cadmium yellow and a tiny bit of cerulean blue to paint the leaves at the bottom of the picture. So I'm going to wet the leaf first, so I'm going to use the wet in wet technique. As beginners, it's much easier for you guys to do this, so it gives you that time to apply the paint without getting any hard lines. So I'm just filling in that shape, being really careful where I'm wetting the paper, making sure that I've wet all the way up to the edges, and then I'm going to add the yellow-green colour to that damp area. You can see that the paint just runs into the water, so it doesn't create any hard lines at all. It just creates a nice flat wash that's still workable for a couple of minutes before it starts to dry. So I've filled that shape in with the yellow-green colour, and while it's still damp, I can go into it with some of the burnt sienna to add details. So this is just using the very tip of my brush. Again, I think I'm using a number 6 brush, and you can see how it's blending with that yellow-green colour. So there's quite a lot of water in this burnt sienna mix at the moment. It's very, very watery in consistency. And I'm going to pop it down on the surface, allow it to blend with that green. But then I'm going to go into a much thicker consistency of burnt sienna paint. So this time there's not much water at all. That way it creates a darker colour and it doesn't move so much on the surface of the paper. It almost stays where I place it. Because it's a thicker consistency, it doesn't want to run or spread quite so far. You can see that creates some lovely marks on the leaves. Again, use your reference image as a guide. Obviously your image doesn't, your painting doesn't need to be exactly like the reference photo, but use it as a guide. And you can add whatever details you like to. And once again, once the paper starts to dry, you don't want to go any further. You need to allow it to fully dry then. So I'm going to do exactly the same for the second leaf. Wet the surface first, really carefully with a brush, just so it's damp. You don't want it to be soaking wet. You don't want little puddles of water on there. You just want a soft sheen. And then using that yellow-green paint, I'm filling the space. Going in first of all with the light mix of burnt sienna, and then afterwards with the thicker, darker mix of burnt sienna. You can see that that actually really helps with the detail there. So I'm adding some ultramarine blue to the burnt sienna now to darken it up. And you can see that's a nice shade of dark brown. And I'm going to enhance the shadows on the stems. So I'm adding that darker mix to this central stem because the shadow wasn't dark enough. I'm doing this on dry paper. And this centre stem is really quite dark. Now I'm going to add some dark brown details to some of the other stems and shadows. So this is adding a shadow that goes all the way down the side of this stem. And I also want to add some fine lines across the surface as well, because you can see them on the reference image. These stems have got quite a sort of a linear texture to them, which is nice to paint. It's a lovely detail to add. So if those lines are a bit harsh, you can go in with a damp brush and just soften those lines off. It just blends them in a little bit. And then just go around the rest of the painting, adding these dark details where you can see them. It really makes the painting come to life. It makes them look much more three-dimensional. It also enhances the edges of your shapes. So sometimes I'm wetting the area first slightly to create a softer mark and then going in with the brown. And now we need to add the hairs that are on the sides of those stems that we've just painted. So we're going to use the yellow ochre for this. Again, painting on dry paper because this is detail now and we don't need to pre-wet. We want to draw a line straight down the side of the stem and then drag some of that yellow ochre paint out to create these little spike details of the hairs of the plant. And I find if you don't take too long doing this, it stops you from fiddling. So if you paint this quite quickly, you get a sort of a more natural look and it's less fiddly. It also helps you to be a little bit more random with your marks as well. So work your way around the painting, adding these little hairs that you can see. They're like little triangles on this particular stem. If you look at your reference image, they're like sort of little triangles. There's gaps between the hairs on this one. And sort of work your way from top to bottom, adding these extra details in. It's lovely because it shows the light hitting that side of the plant. So I've carried the stem along in the background of that centre teasel there. So that stem didn't actually extend further, but I've done that. I've added that myself because it looked a bit odd. So I've just carried on that line and now I'm just adding some hairs to that fictitious stem that I've created there. So you can use your artistic license at any point, you know. These paintings are yours, guys, to have fun with. Now I've realised that the left and the right teasel heads are much lighter than the centre one. So I'm just darkening it up by adding another layer of paint. So if you wet the teasel head first, then add some of your burnt sienna. And exactly the same to this one on the left here. So I'm adding some burnt sienna and also a little bit of the purple as well, and dragging some of the burnt sienna out into those spikes and darkening some of the shadows. So now I'm using a slightly darker mix of green. So just added more paint to the green mix to thicken it up, and I'm just painting over the top of those curly pieces that are at the bottom of the teasel heads there. So I'm just painting them in to create depth and make them look, they didn't stand out quite enough, so adding those to there just to add those finishing touches. So work your way around. Remember, move your board around to make it easier for you to paint. And then you'll have much more detail. Thanks for joining me today. Subscribe and click the bell to get notifications of my videos. I'll have another video for you next Watercolour Wednesday, so don't forget to join me then. Also, check out this video that I'm linking above. I think you'll enjoy it. Take care, and I'll see you next week.